There's a case out of the Supreme Court of New York that was filed. It's Dunphy versus Rudy Giuliani. And in that case, in that civil case against Rudy Giuliani, it's alleged in the pleadings that Jared Kushner and Rudy Giuliani had a scheme in place to cause folks to pay them $2 million for a pardon or a commutation. And that's just an allegation that is made, no proof, but it's made in a pleading. The lady says, Dunphy says that this is what Giuliani told her. And so this is the kind of, this is what ensues from the kind of process that was in place during the Trump administration insofar as pardons and commutations are concerned. Professor Osler, can you walk us through how past administrations have typically reached pardon and clemency decisions and how that process differed from whatever the process was for Trump?
Yes, and frankly, the process has been, as I described earlier, for the past 5 or 6 administrations, going back to the Reagan administration. So they've all been failed in the same way. And we've seen over and over this mad rush at the end where they realize they want to do something. That brings us things like, what we saw with Mark Rich coming through at the end as well. And this invites all kinds of terrible problems. And probably more than looking at prior administrations, which had the same system, it's smart to look at other states or the state systems where we do see some high functioning.
I guess the point I want to make is that it is a good idea to have a system in place like the Obama administration had that it did not deviate from, and there was no mad rush to issue pardons and commutations at the end of, in the final hours of a administration, and the mechanism protected against insiders getting pardoned, like Paul Manafort and Roger Stone. That's the point that I want to make. But as far as this case, Mr. Informers, that we're talking about today, this is a gentleman who was convicted in the largest healthcare fraud scheme ever investigated by the Department of Justice. A federal jury convicted Mr. Informers on 20 of 26 counts and sentenced him to 20 years in prison. And so he was 6 counts hung jury, and those hung jury counts were just hanging out there as he was serving his sentence, whereupon Trump, out of his back pocket with no process, just decided to pardon him. I don't know whether or not it was because somebody paid someone to get that action. I'm not making that allegation, but the fact is he got out, but those charges were still pending. And so hasn't it been your experience that prosecutors have the authority to retry a defendant who has been acquitted on some charges with other charges having arrived at a hung jury and no final disposition on? Don't prosecutors have the power to retry the individual?
Yeah, as Mr. Tolman said earlier, I agree with him that does happen, and that's understanding the law.
That's prosecutorial discretion. The case had not been dead docketed or no prost because the individual had not completed his or her sentence. And talking about Mr. Informers, had not completed his sentence, so those charges that the jury hung on were still hanging out there, and then he gets a clemency, gets out of jail, and now the prosecution wants to charge him, wants to try him on those charges. Nothing wrong with that. Happens every day. And by the way, Republicans talk about a two-tier system of justice, but they talk about it in terms of being for white males who've always been privileged, when I find that we have a two-tier system of justice for people of color.
Gentlemen's time has expired. That is some of the most outrageous, I recognize myself for my 5 minutes, which I haven't taken. This is some of the most outrageous, illogical argument I've heard. Let me ask each of you, does it happen all the time, as the gentleman just said, where a president grants a clemency or a commutation, and then the DOJ says, we're gonna go back, reinvigorate our prosecution against that person? Does that happen?
I did as much research as I could, and I cannot find a single instance of DOJ re-prosecuting a commutation.
Not a single case. Mr. Ostler, did you find any case? You were of any case?
As I said, I didn't do a systemic check, but I don't know of one. Now, I understood the question to be about hung counts generally where you don't have a commutation.
Right, but that is not what that's not the conclusion he drew, right? And Professor Berman?
Yeah, I was struck because I'm not aware of any case, let alone cases happening all the time, where there's a re-prosecution after a clemency grant.
And let me just tell you, my experience, I wasn't a federal prosecutor, but I can tell you my experience is, if you got convictions over here, you had a case sitting over here on a hung jury, we typically would just be happy and move on, and that's typically what happened. And in this particular instance, the prosecutors said they were going to move on. Right, Mr. Tolman?
May I clarify one thing? Yeah. You know, he raises, I don't like the process. I'm not defending the process that occurred under President Trump, but it occurs under every president towards the end, and it is not the right process. But I can say Mr. Esformes did not use money or political influence to get his commutation. In fact, he had two prior attorneys general, Ed Meese and Michael Mukasey, and Deputy Attorney General Larry Thompson requesting that he receive clemency, largely based on misconduct that DOJ admitted to that was reckless.
Right. I'm glad you brought up the misconduct, which nobody has brought up before. I'm going to ask you some more generic questions and try to get at this. Do you see any limitation in the Constitution right now on a president granting clemency, pardon, or commutation? Professor Berman.
In all Supreme Court cases, and obviously the text it's extraordinarily broad, covering all federal offenses except in cases of impeachment.
Right, that's the way I read it. It's just really broad. I don't know what the limitation is other than impeachment, right? So that this notion that somehow it's okie dokie to go back in and basically take this Mr. Esformes and say, well, doggone it, we thought he had a really bad set of facts, and so we need to retry him on some of these things to hold him accountable. I'm sorry, appears to me to be biased or motivated from something other than the crime, because they used the hung jury crimes to enhance his sentence. Is that not true, Mr. Ostler?
I believe that the sentence was drawn in part from the hung jury.
Right. So they used those as essentially as enhancers to the sentencing. Right?
Well, the way that sentencing guidelines work, that there's going to be enhancements that come in.
Right, but not typically hung jury or acquitted cases, right, Mr. Tolman?
Yeah. That's one of the great flaws in the federal system, and I argue is unconstitutional, is that you are allowing judges to sentence on acquitted conduct and even uncharged conduct.
Yeah, that's true, and that's a different issue that we got to get to and fix as well. That's ridiculous.
I'm glad to help on that.
Yeah.
I will say this, that when I teach my first-year law students about the use of acquitted conduct to sentence, they are appalled. It is the one time I see consciences actively being shocked.
And I will just tell you that it's really different from the state cases, too, that I was involved in. You never could use that kind of enhancement for sentencing. That's pretty amazing. So as we get through here, we've got a lot of work on our plate that we have to do, and we're going to keep going forward with that. And so I just want to say, as we close out the hearing, thank you for being here. I think it is a travesty that we're here on the Esformes case. It's a travesty that we have a process that is seems to be almost unrelentingly broken that has to be fixed. And so I'm certain that my ranking member and I will be happy to work with you all and see if we can come up with some meaningful changes and returns. With that, we're adjourned.
Would you allow me just for a moment?
That was my 5 minutes, and no, we're done. We're adjourned.
Go ahead.